If your mom's really being beaten, she should be dead by now, not letting her daughter come here to put on a show. The entire bar fell silent after that line. The thin, rain-soaked girl just bowed her head, clutching the blood-stained USB in her trembling hands. No one knew she hadn't come for help. She'd come to see which of them would recognize the voice now playing through the old radio, the voice of the woman they thought they'd killed. As the recording played screams mixing with their own drunken laughter from that night, every biker froze. And in the moment, they understood the bar doors locked automatically. The girl finally lifted her head, eyes cold as glass. Now tell me who's really trapped. The bar was a grimy hole in the wall called Ash Serpent's Den, tucked in the rotting heart of Black Spine, a town that smelled like diesel and regret. Arindra Kale stood there, barely 19, her dark hoodie clinging to her skinny frame, water dripping onto the warped wooden floor. Her face was scratched up, not from a fight but from running through the brambles to get here. She didn't look like much too small, too plain, her hair a wet mess plastered to her cheeks. The bikers sprawled across tables littered with beer cans, saw her and smelled blood. Not the kind on her hands, but the kind that comes from weakness. They thought she was nobody, just a kid who wandered into the wrong place. Marrow Finn leaned back in his chair, his boots propped on a table, a cigarette dangling from his lips. He was 42, with a face like a bulldog and a rap sheet that included gun running, and worse. He smirked, his voice cutting through the smoky air. "What's this? Little girl lost her mommy. Go cry somewhere else, sweetheart. This ain't a daycare." The others laughed, a low, ugly sound that rolled through the room like thunder. A guy in a leather vest, his arms covered in tattoos of skulls and snakes, tossed an empty beer can. It hit Arindra's shin and clattered to the floor. She didn't flinch, just stood there, her hands tight around that USB, her eyes fixed on the floor. A woman in the corner, her nails painted blood red, and her earrings dangling like chandeliers, stood up with a fake pout. She was the kind who'd smile while slipping poison in your drink. "Oh, honey, you look like you got lost on your way to the thrift store," she said, her voice syrupy but sharp. "Why don't you run home and let the grown-ups talk?" The crowd snickered, feeding off her venom. She sauntered closer, her heels clicking, and flicked a speck of mud off Arindra's sleeve, like it offended her. Arindra's eyes flicked up just for a moment, and the woman stepped back like she'd seen something she didn't expect. "What's that look?" she snapped, but Arindra just turned her head slow, like she was dismissing a child. Another biker, a wiry guy with a gold chain and a fake tan, piped up. He was the kind who'd sell his own sister for a better seat at the table. "Hey kid, you got any cash? Or what you gonna trade that ratty bracelet for our help?" He pointed at the thin leather band on her wrist, the only thing she wore that wasn't soaked. The room roared again, louder this time, and a woman with bottle blonde hair and too much lipstick leaned forward. "Maybe she's selling something else," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, the kind that hides a knife. "What's under that hoodie, huh? You think you can just walk in here and beg?" Arindra's head stayed down, but her fingers twitched just once like she was counting something. A guy at the bar, his hands greasy from working on bikes all day, slammed his glass down. He was broad with a beard that looked like it could hide a knife, and eyes that didn't trust anyone. "You're wasting our time, girl," he growled, leaning over the counter. "You think you can just walk in here, cry a little, and we'll play hero? Look at you. Nobody's coming to save you or your mom." He spat on the floor, missing her shoes by an inch. The others nodded, their laughter fading into something meaner, like they were waiting for her to break. Arindra's lips parted just enough to let out a single word: "Good." The room went quiet, and the guy's face twisted like he wasn't sure if he'd been insulted or challenged. Riven Hark sat at the far end of the bar, his leather jacket creaking as he shifted. At 38, he was the leader of the Ash Serpents, a man who could make a room go quiet with a glance. His eyes were dark sharp, like they could cut through steel. He didn't laugh with the others, just watched his fingers tapping slow on the neck of his beer bottle. He raised an eyebrow barely, and the room took it as permission to keep going. Another guy, fat and sweaty with a beard that looked like it hadn't been washed in a decade, stood up. "Get out of here, kid. You're ruining the vibe. What you think you're special? Look at you, dressed like you crawled out of a dumpster." Arindra lifted her eyes, then just enough to meet his. "You done?" She asked, her voice low steady, like she was asking about the weather. The guy froze, his mouth half open like he'd been slapped. The room went quiet for a second, but then Marrow laughed, breaking the spell. "Oh, she's got a mouth. Cute. Let's see how tough you are when you're out in the rain again." He stood cracking his knuckles and took a step toward her. The others egged him on, their voices a mix of jeers and whistles. Arindra didn't move. Her hands stayed on that USB, her shoulders square, like she was rooted to the floor. One of the younger bikers, barely out of his teens with a shaved head and a nervous grin, decided to join in. He was the kind who followed the loudest voice, desperate to prove he belonged. "Hey, look at her shoes," he said, pointing at Arindra's worn sneakers, the soles peeling off. "Bet they're older than she is. You steal those from a homeless camp." The room erupted again, and he puffed out his chest, proud of his shot. Arindra tilted her head just a fraction and looked at him. "They got me here," she said, her voice so calm it felt like a blade. The kid's grin faltered and he looked away, suddenly interested in his beer. The others didn't notice, but Riven did, his fingers pausing on the bottle. The bar's old radio crackled, then cutting through the noise. A news bulletin came on, the voice sharp and urgent. "Breaking news: an attack on the old military base outside Black Spine. Suspected ties to the Ash Serpents gang. Authorities are investigating." The room went still. Riven's fingers stopped tapping. Marrow's smirk faded. Arindra didn't look surprised. She reached into her hoodie, slow, deliberate, and pulled out the USB. It was small, rusted, the kind of thing you'd find in a junk drawer. But it had a military stamp on it, faded but clear. "My mom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "was an engineer at that base. If she dies, this gets out. And you all burn." A woman in the back, her face half hidden by a cowboy hat, laughed. But it was sharp, nervous. She was the kind who'd claw her way to the top of any group, all fake charm and sharp elbows. "Oh, please," she said, standing and crossing her arms. "You think we're scared of a little stick? What's it got your mom's diary?" She walked over, her boots loud against the floor, and snatched the USB from Arindra's hand, holding it up like a trophy. "This is nothing," she said, tossing it onto the table. It skidded, stopping right in front of Riven. He didn't touch it, but his eyes flicked to Arindra, and for the first time, there was something like doubt in them. She didn't move, just watched the USB, her hands still in her pockets. The bikers stared, some confused, some angry. Marrow snorted, but it sounded forced. "What, you think you're some kind of spy? That thing's probably fake. You're full of it, kid." Riven didn't say anything, but his eyes locked on the USB, then on Arindra. He knew that base. Only a handful of people did. It was a ghost, a place the government pretended didn't exist. He leaned forward, his voice calm but heavy. "What's on it?" Arindra didn't blink, enough to make sure none of you see daylight again. The room stayed quiet, but you could feel the shift, like the air got heavier. Riven stood his chair, scraping the floor. "Get her in the truck. We're going to find her mom." As they moved toward the door, a grizzled biker with a scar across his cheek blocked Arindra's path. He was the kind who'd seen too much and cared too little, his hands calloused from years of breaking things. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice low, like he was daring her to try. "You think you can just walk in here, throw around threats, and we'll jump. You're nothing but a scared little girl." He leaned in close, his breath sour with whiskey, and grabbed her arm. Arindra didn't pull away. She just looked at him, her eyes steady, and said, "You're holding the wrong person." He let go, stepping back like he'd been burned, and the others exchanged glances uneasy. They piled into two beat-up trucks, the rain hammering the metal roofs. Arindra sat in the back of one, squeezed between two bikers, who kept muttering about how she'd better not be lying. Marrow drove his hands tight on the wheel, his eyes flicking to her in the rearview mirror. "You're gonna regret this," he said, his voice low. "Playing games with us. You're nothing. Just a kid with a story." Arindra didn't answer. She just stared out the window, watching the rain streak across the glass, her fingers tracing the edge of that leather bracelet. The truck hit a pothole and she braced herself, her face blank like she'd been through worse. In the second truck, a biker with a patchy beard and twitchy hands kept glancing at Arindra's reflection in the side mirror. He was the nervous type, always looking for an angle, always scared he'd miss it. "Hey, you ever think maybe she's wired?" He whispered to the guy next to him, his voice barely audible over the engine. "Like, what if she's a Fed or something?" The other guy, a hulking figure with a shaved head, laughed it off, but his eyes stayed on Arindra like he was trying to figure her out. She caught his stare in the mirror and held it just for a second before turning back to the window. The guy looked away, his hands fidgeting with a knife he kept pulling out and flipping shut. They stopped at an old warehouse on the edge of town, a place that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The air smelled like rust and oil. Marrow yanked Arindra out of the truck, his grip hard enough to bruise. "All right, princess," he said, shoving her toward the dirt. Where's this chip gonna take us? Or you just making it up? He grabbed the USB from her hand and tossed it into a fire pit nearby, the flames licking up around it. Arindra hit the ground, her palms scraping the gravel. She didn't cry out, just looked at him, her eyes like ice, like she was seeing something he couldn't. As the USB burned, a faint beep came from Arindra's pocket. Nobody heard it over the rain, but her hand moved just slightly, brushing against her keychain. The warehouse door creaked, and a gust of wind blew in, carrying the smell of wet earth. Vexa Lowen, the only woman in the gang, stepped forward. She was 33 with white blonde hair tied back tight, her face marked with scars from her days as a battlefield medic. She knelt beside Arindra, her voice soft but firm. She might be telling the truth, Marrow. Let's hear her out. Marrow spun on her, his face red. You don't get to talk, Vexa. I say what's real here. He raised his boot and brought it down on Arindra's hand hard. The crack of bone against bone echoed in the rain. Arindra didn't scream. She just looked at him, her eyes steady, like she was measuring him for a coffin. A tiny light flickered on her keychain, a small metal thing clipped to her hoodie. Nobody noticed at first. Then the bar's security cameras, long broken, or so they thought, flickered to life. A grainy video played on a cracked screen inside the warehouse. It showed the ash serpents months ago, laughing as they dragged a woman into a van. Her screams were muffled, but her voice was clear. You'll pay for this, she'd said. Vexa's hands froze. She recognized that voice. She'd pulled that woman from a ditch barely alive and patched her up. It was Arindra's mom. The room went quiet, the bikers staring at the screen, then at Arindra. She stood brushing the dirt off her knees. You thought she was dead, she said, her voice flat. You were wrong. One of the bikers, a lanky guy with a missing tooth and a habit of chewing on his nails, backed away from the screen. He was the kind who'd do anything for a quick buck, no questions asked. That's not possible, he muttered, his voice shaking. We took care of her. He looked at Arindra, his eyes wide like he was seeing a ghost. She didn't respond, just picked up a piece of gravel from the ground and rolled it between her fingers like it was a reminder of something. The other bikers started whispering their voices, low, panicked. Vexa stood, her hands still bloody from trying to help Arindra, and said, We need to stop this. Now, but nobody listened. They were too busy watching Arindra, waiting for her next move. Riven's face didn't change, but his hands clenched into fists. He'd been there that night. He hadn't thrown a punch, but he'd given the order. He stepped closer to Arindra, his voice low. What do you want? She didn't smile, didn't gloat, just tilted her head like she was studying him. I want you to know what it feels like to lose everything. The words hung there heavy like the rain outside. Marrow laughed, but it was nervous now, his eyes darting to the others. She's bluffing, he said, but nobody backed him up. The air felt wrong, like something was about to break. A phone buzzed in the pocket of a biker, standing near the door. He was older, with a gray ponytail and a limp from an old fight. He pulled it out, his face paling as he read the screen. It's online, he said, his voice barely a whisper. The video, it's everywhere. He held up his phone, showing a social media feed, where the clip of the serpent's attack was spreading comments, piling up, people tagging the sheriff, the mayor, anyone who'd listen. Arindra didn't look at the phone. She just adjusted her hoodie, pulling the hood tighter, like she was shielding herself from the rain that wasn't falling anymore. The biker dropped his phone, the screen cracking on the concrete. We're done, he said, his voice breaking. Sheriff Halden Roque burst through the warehouse doors, his badge glinting under the flickering lights. He was 55, with a gut that strained his uniform and eyes that never quite met yours. He played the part of the good cop, but everyone knew he took money from the serpents to look the other way. All right, everybody, calm down, he said, his voice loud, fake confident. This girl's a problem, a witness. We need to handle this. He looked at Arindra like she was a bug he could squash. Riven turned his gun already in his hand. Handle what, Halden? You set us up. The sheriff's smile faltered just for a second. One of Roque's deputies, a young guy with a buzz cut and a nervous tic, hesitated at the door. He was the kind who followed orders because he didn't know what else to do. Sheriff, maybe we should... He started, but Roque cut him off with a glare. Shut up, Tommy, he snapped. This ends now. He pulled his own gun, pointing it at Arindra, but his hand shook just enough to notice. Arindra didn't move, didn't blink. She just reached into her pocket slow and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She tossed it to the ground where it landed at Roque's feet. It was a photo, old and creased, of him, shaking hands with a man in a suit, a stack of cash on the table between them. You dropped something. She said her voice so quiet it barely carried. Marrow didn't wait. He grabbed Riven's gun, his face twisted with rage. "This is your fault," he shouted at Arindra, raising the barrel toward her. Vexa moved faster, throwing herself in front of the girl. The shot rang out and Vexa hit the ground, blood pooling under her. Arindra didn't scream, didn't cry. She just knelt beside Vexa, pressing her hands to the wound, her face blank, but her fingers shaking. The other bikers backed away, their bravado gone. Riven stared at Marrow, his eyes dark with something close to hate. "You idiot," he said, his voice barely a whisper. A low rumble started outside, like a truck idling too close. The bikers looked around confused as the sound grew louder. Arindra didn't look up from Vexa, but her lips moved, whispering something nobody could hear. The warehouse doors rattled and a gust of wind blew through, carrying a faint whirring sound. One of the bikers, a guy with a neck tattoo and a habit of cracking his knuckles, ran to the door and looked out. "What the hell is that?" He shouted, his voice high with panic. Above the warehouse, tiny lights blinked in the sky, moving in formation. Drones, dozens of them, their cameras glinting like eyes. Arindra's hands paused on Vexa's wound, and she looked up, her face calm. "It's starting," she said like she was announcing dinner. The radio crackled again, and a woman's voice came through, clear and strong. "Arindra, now's the time." The bikers froze. That voice, it was her mom. Alive? Arindra's keychain glowed brighter, and the warehouse lights flickered out. The whole town went dark. From the roof, a low hum started, and then dozens of tiny drones buzzed into the air. Their screens lit up, projecting videos across the walls, clips of the sheriff taking bribes, the serpents beating people in alleys, deals made in back rooms. The truth laid bare for anyone to see. Arindra stood, her hoodie still dripping, her voice steady. "You built this town on lies," she said. "Now it's coming down." Outside, the townspeople were gathering. Someone had seen the drones, the videos, and word spread fast. Phones were out, live streaming the chaos. Sheriff Roque tried to run, but the crowd blocked him, their faces hard, angry. "You sold us out," an old man shouted, his voice shaking with years of pent-up rage. Marrow tried to push through, but his own guys turned on him. One of them, a kid barely 20, grabbed a chain from a bike and wrapped it around Marrow's wrists. "You're done," the kid said, his voice breaking. Marrow just stood there, his face blank, like he couldn't believe it was over. A woman in the crowd, her hair gray and her hands calloused from years of factory work, pushed to the front. She was the kind who'd raised 3 kids on nothing but grit, the kind who'd seen too much to stay quiet. She held up her phone, the drone footage still playing, and pointed at Roque. "My brother died because of you," she said, her voice steady but raw. "You let these animals run this town." The crowd surged, their voices rising, and Roque stumbled back, his badge catching the light like a cheap trinket. Arindra watched from the warehouse door, her face unreadable, her hands stuffed in her pockets. She didn't cheer, didn't shout, just stood there like she was waiting for something else. Riven looked at Arindra, his jaw tight. "You played us," he said, not angry, just stating a fact. "You and your mom, you burned this whole place to the ground." Arindra met his eyes, her face calm but unyielding. "You took everything from us." First, she said, "This is just what's owed." She picked up Riven's gun from the floor, her movements slow, deliberate. The room tensed, waiting for her to pull the trigger. Instead, she held it out to him. "Protect my mom," she said. "That's your only way out." Riven took the gun, his hands steady, and nodded once. He scooped up Vexa, still breathing, and ran for the door. As Riven disappeared into the rain, a biker with a limp and a face like weathered leather stepped forward. He was the kind who'd seen empires fall and didn't care who was in charge as long as he got paid. "You think this changes anything?" he said to Arindra, his voice low, almost sad. "You tore it all down, but what's left?" "Nothing." He spat on the ground, his eyes never leaving hers. Arindra didn't answer. She just reached down, picked up Vexa's dropped knife, and tucked it into her sleeve, her movement smooth, like she'd done it 1,000 times. The biker watched, his face tightening, like he'd just realized she wasn't just a kid. The warehouse shook as something exploded outside, a gas line maybe, or one of the drones. The data from Arindra's chip was already spreading, leaking onto the dark web, hitting news outlets, going viral. Sheriff Roque was found the next morning dead in his cell, a single bullet through his temple. Nobody asked too many questions. Arindra and her mom were gone, by then vanished into the night like they'd never been there. The town was left picking up the pieces, trying to make sense of what had happened. The Ash Serpents were done their name Poison now. Days later, a barmaid from the Ash Serpent's den, A quiet woman with tired eyes and a habit of wiping her hands on her apron found something under a table. It was a small notebook, its pages worn, filled with sketches of circuits and codes. She flipped through it, her hands shaking, and saw a note in the margin, "For the ones who stay." It was Arindra's handwriting, though the barmaid didn't know it. She tucked it into her pocket, her face pale, and walked out into the street, where the town was still buzzing with rumors. She didn't tell anyone what she'd found. Not yet. But she kept it close, like a secret she wasn't ready to share. A year later, Riven was on a highway, his bike the only thing he had left. The rain was coming down hard just like that night. He stopped at a gas station, his hands shaking as he lit a cigarette. A message came through on his phone, an anonymous number, a video file. It was Arindra's face, smiling, her eyes still cold as glass. "I never died," she said, her voice soft but clear. Under the video was a code: Operation Rebirth Phase 2. Riven's cigarette fell from his fingers, burning out in the rain. It crossed black spine, envelopes started showing up, photos, documents, proof that the rot went deeper all the way to a weapons conglomerate that had funded the Serpents for years. In a small diner on the edge of town, a man sat alone, his hands wrapped around a cold coffee. He was a former Serpent, one of the few who'd walked away before it all fell apart. He'd been there that night laughing with the others, but now his face was hollow, his eyes haunted. A waitress dropped a newspaper on his table, the headline screaming about the conglomerate's collapse. He opened it, and a photo slipped out. Arindra standing in the rain, her hoodie dark with water. He stared at it, his hands trembling, and whispered, "She warned us." The waitress didn't hear, but she saw the look on his face and backed away like she'd seen a ghost. The town never forgot her. Neither did the people who'd laughed, who'd thrown that beer can, who'd told her she didn't belong. They saw her face on those drones in their nightmares, in the quiet moments when they couldn't lie to themselves anymore. She hadn't just exposed them. She'd changed the rules, made them see what happens when you push too far. When you think you're untouchable, when you forget that even the smallest spark can start a fire. You know what it's like? To be counted out, to be laughed at, to stand there holding your ground while the world tries to tear you down. You weren't wrong to keep going. You weren't alone in that fight. And she wasn't either. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.